and therefore serves as a synonym for force. Gandhi, thus began to call the Indian movement Satyagraha, that is to say, the force which is born of truth and love. End of quote. The forceful and activist character of Satyagraha should correct a common misperception, namely that Satyagraha denotes a mere passivity of resistance, a turning of the other cheek. On the contrary, Gandhi insisted that violence be met with love and understanding. The non-violent means chosen should not obscure the powerful end, that of establishing justice and truth. In fact, he's on record as saying that if the choice were between passive acceptance of injustice on the one hand and violent resistance to it on the other, he would choose violent resistance. However, he was convinced that there was a third alternative that was superior to both, namely nonviolent resistance. Satyagraha begins with reasoning with one's opponent or adversary in an attempt to arrive at a just solution, recognizing that no party has a monopoly on the truth or is wholly in the right. The purpose, therefore, is to work out a rational compromise that will be agreeable to both sides. It is only when such processes of reasoning, persuasion, and compromise have been tried and have proved unsuccessful that one adopts the direct action techniques of Satyagraha. Satyagraha involves performing actions such as non-cooperation, strikes, boycotts, fasts, lockouts, etc., civil disobedience in the form of non-payment of taxes, disregard of specific laws or injunctions. Thirdly, publicizing one's causes through marches, rallies, picketing, and other forms of peaceful protest. And finally, and actually very importantly, constructive programs, low-cost housing, education, facilities, cooperative banks for the poor. It's important when we talk about the culture of culture of peace in connection with Gandhi to keep in mind that even though he's known as a political leader, if one looks at Gandhi's life, 4/5 of his life was really spent on in the countryside, forming these ideal communities. And so, much as we tend to see Gandhi as a sort of primarily political person in a conventional sense, his real energy goes as a person who wants to build the culture of peace through these model communities. He formed 2 such communities in South Africa and then 2 such in India. And as I've said, that's where he spent most of his time. A big part of such nonviolent resistance is tapas, or this is a Sanskrit word, or the willingness to suffer for one's cause. As Thomas Pantum puts it, quote, "It is the assumption of Satyagraha that when reasoning fails to move the head, the argument of suffering by the Satyagrahis helps to move the heart of the oppressor or opponent. Self-suffering, moreover, is the truth-serving alternative to the truth-denying method of inflicting violence on others." Contained in the idea of Satyagraha is the question of means and ends, which for Gandhi are 2 sides of the same coin. Gandhi strongly disagrees with the conventional political idea that the ends justify the means. To the contrary, he held that immoral means taint and distort potentially good ends, and to that extent he placed as much, if not more, emphasis on the means, which he described as ends in action. Quote, "The means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree, and there is just the same inviolable connection between the means and the end as there is between the seed and the tree." End of quote. The forceful and activist character of Satyagraha leads naturally to the idea of nonviolence. Gandhi is obviously invoking the Buddhist Jain precept of ahimsa, or not causing deliberate injury or harm to any being. But Gandhi takes the precept far beyond its merely negative formulation to mean by ahimsa the largest love, the greatest charity. I see there in the Joan Baez sort of part of that exhibit where she says that nonviolence is really organized love. I would add to the great Joan Baez, it's a little more than that. Nonviolence is organized love, and I would add justice as well, but you get the idea. But Gandhi, here's a quote. So in other words, he means by ahimsa the largest love, the greatest charity. Quote, "If I am a follower of ahimsa, I must love my enemy or a stranger as I would my wrongdoing father or son. This ahimsa necessarily includes truth and fearlessness." Ahimsa then is the deployment of moral force to persuade one's opponent or adversary. It differs from violence in that it respects the autonomy and dignity of the other, whereas violence does not. It differs from violence in the perpetual willingness to dialogue and negotiate and listen to the other, and as far as is consistent with rightness, to come to a compromise. Given that one's grasp of the truth is at best partial, it is imperative to see and appreciate the truth in the position of the other person, and to try and achieve a higher reconciliation of conflicting ends. This negotiated compromise has the opposite effect of violence, which involves vanquishing and putting down one's opponent, that merely sets up another cycle of resentment, ill will, and further violence. So that, in a sense, whatever victories are achieved through violence are really short-lived victories, as the history of war will amply demonstrate. Of course, Gandhi was not so naive as to think that such moral persuasion would come about easily. He was all too aware that people who exercise power over others are not likely to give it up without some pressure being exerted. All the means of satyagraha mentioned above should then be adopted as a way of morally coercing one's opponent to negotiate. It is true that coercion is being exercised, but it is a coercion that still respects the moral agency and dignity of the other, not least by the willingness to undergo self-suffering. The strategy presupposes, however, that the opponent does have a minimal openness to such moral appeal, a trait that Gandhi was willing to grant to most people. We can argue with this assumption. However, he also recognized that there are madmen and tyrants, rapists and aggressors, who will not fall within that category of people who are open to moral appeal. In those extreme cases, Gandhi was willing to use physical force for the purpose of self-defense, so that it's not a blanket principle. You've got to understand that nonviolence is really a question of the heart, and not a rigid principle. In those extreme cases, Gandhi was willing to use physical force for the purpose of self-defense, as when he sanctioned the use of military force to drive back the Pakistani army in what he considered to be the invasion of Kashmir in 1948. But we don't have to agree with everything that Gandhi says. I personally find less satisfactory his response to the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, when the latter skeptically asked Gandhi whether he thought the Jews should use satyagraha against Hitler, and Gandhi said yes, and then that sort of sparked a long correspondence between Buber and Gandhi. The three concepts I have discussed, satya, satyagraha, and ahimsa, might give us some idea of the texture of Gandhi's ethical thought. As mentioned earlier, the ideas of truth and nonviolence are certainly to be found in the Jain, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions. But there's a big difference between Gandhi's conceptualization of these ideas and traditional ones. The high standards of moral and spiritual discipline that Gandhi invokes were traditionally part of the spiritual practice only of monks and saints, but decidedly not of people in political life. All right. I mean, even in the case of King, there are people who, when they compare King's life with Gandhi, begin to see that this importance of a kind of moral and spiritual discipline was emphasized more by Gandhi than by King. Though, to grant King his own growth, he died after all at the age of 39, his own growth, I think King towards the end of his life was beginning to see